Welcome to Psychedelia Integration. We are a Los Angeles-based psychedelic integration organization since 2016. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we provide support, education, and community using a harm reduction approach for those working with psychedelics. Psychedelic integration is the successful assimilation into one's life of spiritual and psychological insights, emotions, visions, and sensations received during a psychedelic journey for the purpose of healing, growth, and well-being. So tonight we have an awesome presentation for you. State Shifting, the intersection of neurofeedback, psychedelics, and trauma with Heather Hargraves. A little bit about the talk tonight. Neuro and biofeedback technologies can help highlight the various states of awareness that underlie the positive outcomes associated with meditative practices and psychedelic therapies. This focus on state awareness lends itself to psychedelics, which are state-shifting medicines. The use of neurofeedback-inspired therapies, therefore, can help both therapist and client better acquaint themselves with the human capacity to state shift. So we're really excited and glad that Heather Hargraves was able to make it tonight and give us this fantastic talk. Heather is on the cutting edge of these modalities, so this is going to be really a treat for everyone. So Heather's bio: Heather Hargraves, MA, is a trauma therapist and researcher in London, Ontario, Canada. Heather specializes in the use of neuro and biofeedback technologies to support a broad range of neurologically and or psychologically traumatized clients within her clinical practice. Heather is also a neurofeedback and neuromeditation instructor. Heather's research interests investigate the neurological underpinnings of various states of consciousness, including dissociation, meditation, psychedelics, and various polyphasic states of consciousness associated with shamanic practices. Her master's research focused on the therapeutic induction of altered states of consciousness based on research findings related to psilocybin. Prior to her training as a neurofeedback therapist, Heather worked as a yoga and meditation instructor, as well as a reflexologist and Thai massage therapist. It was her personal experience with these modalities that inspired her to pursue further study as a therapist, with a focus toward understanding the neurological underpinnings of these mind-body therapies. Currently, Heather is an advocate for the interface of neurofeedback modalities with psychedelic therapies, with an emphasis on the preparation and integration periods that bookend psychedelic therapies once they are legalized. Welcome, Heather.
We're just going to review the fundamentals of neurofeedback, psychedelics, and their application in psychotherapy through my lens, and take you on a little journey of how I got here and where we're going with Divergence Neuro. There we go. So I really like to look at neurofeedback as relational technology. And when I'm using this technology with clients, I see it as going on a journey into the self. And so it's not that it's a tool that's trying to change who the person is. We're not trying to fix something that's wrong. We're just trying to understand what are the relationships you have with your nervous system and how have those been developed over the lifespan. So here's a few photos of individuals, friends and colleagues and people I've met along the way, including myself. So for those of you who don't work with neurofeedback, this is kind of what it looks like today. We put sensors on the head. I use a technology called BrainMaster. I've got Dr. Michael Winkelman over here on the upper right, and he's an anthropologist who studies altered states, psychedelics, rituals, and shamanism. My colleague, Raphael Lancelota, in the middle. It was his first time getting a qualitative EEG, and he sent me this photo. And he's an expert in 5-MeO-DMT. And then my friend Jose at the bottom left, and he is a virtual reality artist. And we were giving him some gamma PEMF at a psychedelic conference that was happening in Prague. And these sensors do not create any sort of stimulation. All they do is record. And through that recording, then it gets put into a computer, and the computer does some fancy, mathematics to it that then gives me an interface as a clinician that I have learned how to make sense of. So that's kind of what you see on this top one here. There's like a rainbow brain and some brain waves. And then you can see Dr. Winkleman, my friend Raphael, and Jose, and myself with different sensors on our heads, different sensor arrays. Jose here actually has pulsed electromagnetic fields, so that is a STEM exercise. But generally, this is what it looks like when someone's doing neurofeedback. I really like to start with this quote because I think it offers kind of a lens for how to look through and understand what it means to use technology in a relational way and how that might impact the way that we consider and conceptualize mental health going forward. And so it's a Rudolf Steiner quote, and he says, "There will come a time when a diseased condition will not be described as it is today by the physicians and psychologists, but it will be spoken of in musical terms as one would speak of a piano that is out of tune." And when I saw this quote, it really resonated with me because I feel that's often what I'm doing as a neurofeedback practitioner is I'm looking at various brainwaves. So put them all up there. And these various brainwaves are kind of like a choir in the brain. And what we're looking for is specific tones and specific harmonics that indicate that someone's nervous system is in relationship. And a nervous system that's in relationship is one that's very responsive, not one that's reactive or defensive. So it's more as if you can surf your experience as opposed to pre-planning or avoiding that experience. Also, different frequencies in the brain kind of make up the choir, the singers in the choir. So the slower the frequency, the deeper it comes from in the nervous system. So that starts with delta, through theta, through alpha, through beta, and high beta. So the low tones of these deltas and thetas, high tones, betas. And then alpha is kind of like that balancing tone or the rhythm section that kind of keeps everyone together. And then gamma is this special kind of harmonic where gamma tends to be more of an emergent property that we see in the nervous system when someone has a really deep knowing. So when I hear people talking about raising their vibration, I often pause and I wonder, and I've worked with some, flow folks and ask them what they think that means. And my understanding of that is actually you have to dive deep. You have to have really deep roots. You have to be in a deep relationship with yourself so that you can enter through the doorways of delta or theta, which then stack the different brainwaves together. And then we have this nice emergent gamma frequency, which is a sign of like this deep knowing or deep ability to effortlessly engage in whatever task you're engaged in. So we'll often see this in high meditators, for example. So the way that neurofeedback works, if we have a choir, how do we help this choir learn how to be in harmony? So usually there's a conductor. So we use the technology as the conductor and we record the choir. And whenever the choir is singing together and in harmony, they usually get a thumbs up. A thumbs up in neurofeedback means the music will get louder, a game you're playing, one of the guys will race faster than the other. If you're watching a screen, sometimes we use a dimmer screen. So every time you are achieving a goal, which means you are achieving harmony, the screen will clear. Or we can even use haptics, which is more of like a vibrational feeling to help you feel that you're doing what it is the task is asking you to do. There's usually also more of a paradigm of a reward or inhibit. So if I'm rewarding a frequency, if I'm saying, I want the choir to sing higher, and when you start creating more of those higher frequencies in the brain, the music will get louder. And so that's like a high jump. The other is if we're doing an inhibit, there's too much high tones and I want them to come down. Now it's more like a limbo bar. And as the choir sings lower, or the brain regions or the nervous system's relationship changes, then you get the reward when you're kind of going under the limbo bar. Pop them all up, it's easier this way. So another way of understanding this too is to actually kind of flip that choir on its head or on its butt, I guess, if we're looking at delta at the bottom, and see that these frequencies also indicate certain states of awareness
and they're kind of developed through our developmental trajectory. So the deeper the frequency is coming from, the slower it is, delta being the deepest, then theta. We look at alpha, again, that rhythm section, or the one that keeps the harmony in the choir for the most part, as kind of the binding force. It's the mediator between our subconscious and conscious mind, and we'll often describe that in neurofeedback terms as your alpha bridge. And what I want to see is that somebody is in relationship with all of that. And from a developmental trajectory, what that means is that delta is usually dominant when we're really young. And that has a lot to do with our very early orienting responses before the cortex has really pruned and a sense of self has been created. We're really operating from these deeper parts of the nervous system. Then through childhood, children have this wonderful imagery and ability to imagine, and they're kind of in this theta or sometimes trance state where there's really starting to work out their emotional wheelhouse and how do they connect to the world around them. Then around the age of like 10 to 12, our alpha frequency, or that rhythm that the nervous system is guided by, is pretty much set. So our early sense of self is actually all of these together, and how are they nested or stacked, or how is that relationship with each one. Then beta frequencies start coming online. I mean, they're always all there, but they predominate different areas to help you guys kind of understand what the trajectory or what a neurofeedback therapist is even looking at. But beta tends to be more tied to cortical activity, and our prefrontal cortex tends to myelinate around the ages of 18 to 21 up until 25. Like that's really the last developmental push that individuals go through. And then, as I mentioned before, when all of these are in relationship, when we can dive into our subconscious and rise up into our conscious mind, we're more likely to see more gamma frequencies in the brain, particularly if we have honed our embodied awareness towards a certain skill set. So you'll also see, for example, in musicians, when they're playing or listening to music they know really well, you'll see a lot of gamma in their brains. So if I'm developing relational technology, and we're going to use this technology that way, and the technology gives us an overview of how the nervous system or the choir of the nervous system, best sings together. What happens when we're not in relationship with our nervous system? What happens when those different developmental periods were kind of, we ran into traumatic experiences, or we're injured, or different things happened in our lifespan that didn't allow us to really fully deepen that relationship, and instead we moved into these periods of kind of containment or compartmentalization, which create more of a protective nervous system as opposed to a connected nervous system. And I was in a talk with Shinzen Young once, and so I thank him for this, because I find that this metaphor he gave me is really helpful describing this. And he asked me, what's the difference between the fire that warms, these guys with the socks on the one side, and the fire that burns, this woman burning? And what's the difference between, water that's invigorating and water that freezes you? And so I often use this map with my clients, and I kind of call it the universe of emotions. And I try to drop early on this idea of dichotomies or good, bad. I'm more interested in how pleasant or unpleasant is your relationship with your nervous system's ability to feel intensity, sing high notes, or calm and become mild. And so I'll get clients to track, and we try to understand how they're feeling. And then we look at, okay, well, if you feel unpleasant when the choir is singing loud, why might that be? And how can we change that relationship from it feeling like it's burning to helping you feel like it's warming? Because often at the heart of it is the relationship you have with your nervous system, as opposed to the external experience necessarily being pleasant or unpleasant. Because something I like, you may not like, and something someone else may like, I may not like. But we have to figure out those boundaries so that we can deepen our relationship and understand when we do need a boundary and when it is okay to move into connection. And when somebody's had mixed messaging or traumatic experiences growing up, this becomes confusing and experiences that should be pleasant are unpleasant and vice versa. So my early kind of foray into all of this was actually in my undergrad research, where I looked at, we were trying to understand traits and states associated with meditation, and we designed this meditation breath attention score. And the way that that worked is that we looked at 6 different types of meditations, and then we would have their hand on a keyboard and have interval bells going off at different kind of times. So over a 10 or 15 minute period, sometimes they were random, sometimes they were every minute. And we looked at how did someone's ability to say they were in a specific state of meditation tie to these traits that they seem to possess. And so when they were in the state of meditation, I asked you to focus on something. If you stayed focused there, then you would click yes when the bell went off. Yes, I am paying attention. And if you click no, then you click no, I wasn't paying attention. And why we designed this is because there was all these trait measures of mindfulness, but there weren't a lot of state measures of mindfulness. And I came to really recognize that it's not that traits dictate states, it's states that dictate traits. So early research on meditation, the first one that kind of proposed this operational definition that separated the states and traits, proposed that individuals who have been practicing mindfulness or meditation practices successfully should exhibit these 3 core traits of curiosity, openness, and acceptance. And the importance of being able to enter into those traits is tied to someone who has a lot of psychological flexibility. You know, they're more responsive, they can have more connection. We talked about how gamma is that like deep knowing and deep relationship with your early self. So that's where therapy gets into parts work and somatic processing and working on these early defense mechanisms that may have come into play to protect you from whatever was going on in the environment around you. Because if we don't go in and we don't develop that relationship and we don't start rehearsing states that lead to the psychological flexibility, instead we're stuck with, you know, mental illness, isolation, and alexithymia, which is often this disconnect from the body and disconnect from an awareness of what your gut or nervous system is telling you. So early neurofeedback, specifically for addictions and PTSD, was actually very much related to tinkering with this, you know, ability for us to state shift. So this is Elmer Green on the Ganges River, 1973, and he actually hooked up a lot of different sadhus and mystics and meditators to various EEG devices and biofeedback devices. And from that, he even hooked up Stanislav Grof, actually. He came to recognize that there seems to be this capacity for these individuals to enter into these trance states, which means they drop out of the conscious mind and they go into the subconscious mind. And this is still a well-known and well-used neurofeedback protocol today, where we slowly allow a client using 2 different sounds, a river and an ocean sound, to allow their nervous system to learn what does it mean to truly let go and to allow yourself to dive deeper into the nervous system, into some of this more emotional somatic content. And the technology helps keep that person in that state. In the lab I was working in, so after I had done this research on meditation, we were moving into dissociation research, and there was a recognition that, wait a second, what we see going on in this part of the brain called the default mode network, which is tied to our sense of self and tied to our self narrative in many ways, the way it appeared, which was inhibited and quieted because there wasn't a robust sense of self. These individuals are more internalized and also so vigilant that they can't really be in their body. And if they're vigilant enough, then they're actually completely disconnected from their body. But LSD and psilocybin look the same. You know, that quieting that we talk about in psychedelics. It quiets the cognitive part of the brain and allows for more somatic content to come up. It's pretty much what we were doing with neurofeedback when it comes to these alpha theta trainings. And in the lab, they had been looking at a certain form of neurofeedback called alpha down, and I assisted the alpha down researchers in their master's work. And they had found that when we quiet the default mode network, even with technology, there's this rebound effect, which is really similar as to psychedelics, that seems to kind of pull someone out of their dissociative slumber. So when we decided, well, what happens if we actually expand alpha down, which is, kind of the grandchild of alpha theta, and then this third variation came, which was my master's thesis work, where we kind of looked at if we actually squash a broader range of frequencies. So what we actually see in psychedelics is it's not just alpha, even though that alpha drop is one of those biomarkers that's becoming more and more known in the psychedelic field. It was also the frequencies from delta to kind of a low beta that appeared to be quieting as well. So I put a sensor on someone's head and I ran a bunch of studies, and we looked at, hey, what do we notice with this? And we noticed that our results were not unlike those seen in MDMA, but more particularly the orange one, 1 to 20 being the blue one, with psilocybin. So these experiences of unity were reported, and we had used a scale called the Altered States of Consciousness Rating Scale that is well known within psychedelic research. So we had experiences of unity, blissful state, insightfulness, a sense of disembodiment, a reduction in anxiety, and an increase in audiovisual synesthesia. On top of that, I also asked individuals following the study, but 24 hours later, I just asked them, could you just tell me what you noticed and what you felt? Then we kind of ran a factor analysis, and we kind of broke down kind of the themes that were similar there. And a lot of people reported they noticed an elevation in mood, improved focus, they felt calm, relaxed, and tranquil. They had more vivid dreams, and their senses were heightened, altered sense of time, and they had the spontaneous processing. So I had a few individuals then talk about how during the session they noticed all this unconscious content seeming to come up and resolving itself. And it's something that I've continued to see as I work with this clinically. And interestingly, this is actually very similar to what James Fadiman reported in his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, with microdosing. So following my master's, I continued doing research, and I stumbled upon this book, an EEG book, and in it there was a chapter on neuromeditation. So I became really fascinated, and I decided to go and do a training. So this one on the upper left, that was my first training with Dr. Jeff Tarrant. And then Jeff and I became really quick friends because everything that was in the Neuromeditation Institute was pretty much what I had done for my undergrad thesis. So I felt really familiar with the literature. And then we presented together probably a couple months later at the International Society for Neurofeedback Research. And that's us there with David Imes, who's another neurofeedback practitioner. And then in the upper right is me continuing to go through trainings and working with Dr. Tarrant. And now I'm someone who's instructing at the Neuromeditation Institute. So as a quick overview of how the neuromeditations are framed, and we're framing them here as an important way of starting to get a sense of what are these states that we practice to achieve these traits that seem to be tied to greater psychological flexibility. And the metaphor that his wife came up with that I really like is this idea of a garden. And so if we're doing a focused meditation, we're looking at one flower in the garden. If we're doing a mindfulness meditation, now we've gone from a narrow focus to a broader focus, and we're looking at the entire garden, but you're not getting caught on any one thing in the garden. It's a really open, just labeling, noticing kind of space, also called open monitoring. Quiet mind is when we go into the garden at night. So it's when we really quiet the chatter. We're no longer taking in a lot of sensory content, and we're kind of trying to sit in the space or the gap that exists between things. And then loving kindness is the fragrance or the pleasant feeling that you get from spending time in a garden. So when we get into loving kindness meditations, we're really dropping external pointed focus. We enter into a mindful state. the mind really quiets, and we get settled in the warmth of compassion or connection, or really opening ourselves up to that connected nervous system. So what I've come to understand through working with the neuromeditations and reading Shinzen Young's work and different theories on this, it appears that these traits and states are tied to kind of like a fitness program, or if you did CrossFit for your brain and you were able to develop a certain, like, you got your arms, your core, and your legs, this would be akin to that. But in neurofeedback or state training, your arms is more about your ability to be curious, and that's tied to a part of the brain called the central executive network. So now these are networks in the brain, patterns of activation that dictate or underlie and relate to where we put our awareness. Then your core, I would say, is more like your salience network, and that is your felt sense and your ability to both internally and externally feel, which would be the opposite of alexithymia. And then acceptance and commitment, I would say, is tied to the default mode network, which is what a lot of my research was on, and which is what I really came to see the more I worked with this neurofeedback, that it really brought about a sense of acceptance. And I say that's your foundation. So that's like having done squats and making sure that you've got a nice balanced nervous system. The other metaphor that we use, and I just decided not to use it even though it's in front of me, is the bike. So if you imagine you're riding a bike, the frame of the bike is like your default mode network, leg day. The person on the bike, riding the bike, feeling the bike, that's your stabilization point, your core. And then your curiosity or concentration power is your ability then to move the bike where you want to go, because you're uninhibited by the frame of the bike and by the person riding the bike. So I'm here going to propose that I think that state education, when it comes to therapeutic applications, is a really important piece that is often missing, or we attempt to use it therapeutically, but it's really hard to pinpoint, because who can tell whether you're in a state or not? And that's what I think is so wonderful about the neuromeditations, is that we actually have technology that can start to validate whether or not you've entered into these states. And here, Jeff has kind of outlined that focused meditation seems to be good for ADHD because it's a very activating meditation. And not a lot of people know this, but when you have ADHD, you tend to have a slower frontal lobe. That's why they give you stimulants to kind of wake you up. Now, there's various kinds, but that's the most general explanation. Mindfulness is good for stress and anxiety. It's very calming. Quiet mind is really good for that disrupted sense of self. Again, it's tied to that core, right? You need that stabilization, that in order to feel a sense of self that's grounded, and that's also tied to that bridge, that ability for you to go into your conscious and subconscious mind. And then open heart is more tied to when we have depression or relationship issues, but this is also seen as an activating meditation. So if we have state education and we start developing these deeper relationships, what we're actually practicing is something called perceptual diversity. And there's this really wonderful author. It's an older paper, but I still really like it. Dr. Winkleman also has something similar to this, but she says, is polyphasic consciousness necessary for global survival? And it seems that cultures that were polyphasic in their approach have a flexible use of neural networks in such a way that they can more easily access a variety of perceptual processes. So to be polyphasic means that you have the ability to get out of your head. It means that you can use dance and divination and dream and laughter and play and all of these different methods of getting into the body and into the felt sense, and that we value those as much as we value science and cognition and what we do in our normal waking consciousness. And what's really interesting is that research on long-term meditators who then took psilocybin, they saw that the psychedelics seemed to increase context-dependent DMN flexibility, enabling more adaptive allocation of brain resources. So those individuals found that they could deepen their meditation practices more easily. They could drop into themselves more easily. They had an easier time kind of like deepening that relationship. So in some ways, state therapies and psychedelic therapies could be considered polyphasic therapies. And why does this matter? It matters because when we keep our nervous system flexible by making sure that we're using the full capacity of our state changing abilities, we actually get this more hyperplastic state that aids rapid and deep learning that can mediate psychological transformation. A newer paper came out about predicting reactions to psychedelic drugs, and it's a systematic review of the states and traits related to acute drug effects. And if you look here, interestingly, those who tend to have more mystical effects are higher on the traits of absorption, openness, and acceptance. Another word for absorption would be also curiosity. They also include surrender, which I often call allowing. But those individuals who struggled and had adverse effects, they were higher on preoccupation, apprehension, and confusion. Those are individuals who are not in relationship with their nervous system. And so they said, if states and traits that facilitate the benefits of psychedelics become firmly established, then a natural question will be how to alter those baseline variables to enhance treatment effects. So what I'm proposing here is that actually I think neurofeedback is a wonderful adjunct to psychedelics, not only as a training modality, but also as an assessment tool to help us better understand when somebody is actually ready for a psychedelic experience. You know, if I took someone to the gym and they'd never been before and I just go throw 100 pounds at them, they're likely to get injured. So if you take an individual who's not in relationship and has never stretched their nervous system and you think a psychedelic is just going to be the thing that snaps it open, sometimes that can be a very difficult experience, or they don't even feel much, or potentially we more deeply entrench their defense mechanisms. So one of the ways we're proposing of starting to assess individuals before a psychedelic experience is using this idea of phenotypes. So EEG phenotypes are these semi-stable states that kind of represent different neurophysiological functions. They give you a sense of where somebody's relation to their nervous system is at. And we've already shown and seen that certain phenotypes do not respond well to medications. And there's a few that have been proposed as potentially we should be cautious before taking psychedelics if we are demonstrating these specific patterns in the brain. And that's because we're moving into this decade of translation. It's really exciting. You know, we've discovered these new methods. We're kind of found some of these neuromarkers. And now can we actually start using these to personalize care for the prevention of diseases? So I've got my shirt on today. Just got it yesterday. I'm part of founding a company called Divergence Neuro, where we have worked really hard based on a need that I see and that I see in the community around me to make neurofeedback more accessible and also make it more portable, and starting to use dry sensors. And in our goal to not only develop this neurofeedback platform, we've partnered, or we're not partnered, we're working with a group called Entheon, and we're starting to work towards this EEG analysis, AI, machine learning base for predicting biomarkers, understanding when somebody's ready for a psychedelic experience, figuring out what neurofeedback protocols might be best for them to accompany them through the psychedelic experience. But the overall idea here is that our platform is going to be kind of like a kitchen. So these phenotypes that we discover and the research we do with other individuals like Entheon, they're kind of like the special sauce, these biomarkers. But then the therapists themselves are like the cooks, and then the headsets are basically utensils. And I actually have one, which we'll talk about later, right here. It's called the Neurosity Crown. So we'll work with a bunch of different headset manufacturers. We are primarily a software platform. Then we have chefs, who are the teachers and the lineages, and then recipes, which would be the applications or the protocols. So here's a picture of our app. It's pretty much ready to go. It's already working with the headset currently, and we can do some quiet mind exercises. It allows the therapist to kind of engage both from a distance, and allows the individuals to train on their own, but the therapist has kind of devised what it is they're going to do. Here's a picture of two of the headsets that we're going to be launching with. But in the end, the whole point of this is coming back to this idea of relational technology. So I really like this Carl Rogers quote. It said, in my early professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? But now I would phrase the question in this way, how can I provide a relationship which this person may use for his or her personal growth? And that's really something that I think neurofeedback technology can offer, because it really focuses on that relationship, but from a state perspective. So arguing that neurofeedback can be used to attune our embodied awareness, highlighting and cultivating deeper harmonic relationships with aspects of states and states of self-awareness. So if you like, you can go to the Neuro Meditation Institute. Right on the home page, we have a free mini course, and you can go in and take a quiz and get a sense of where's your brain at and which meditations may be best for you. And sometimes having meditations that match what exercises you need can be an easier way of entering into a meditation practice if you've been finding it challenging to do so. And for anyone who may be a clinician, the Mind Foundation, the APT course, is happening in Berlin, but it's happening online. And I think they're looking to shorten it just to 2 years instead of 3. But it's the first psychedelic psychotherapy training that's going to include neuromeditation training and neurofeedback theory as something that these clinicians will learn. So I'm going to leave you with a final quote. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So I encourage, deep sitting, getting closer to your roots. And if it's challenging for you to do that, then find a relationship with a clinician who can support you in getting there. So here's 2 links if you want to know more about what I'm up to. Otherwise, thank you very much, guys, for coming. I look forward to chatting with you now.
Thank you so much, Heather.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Fantastic. So much rich information in there. I need to watch it 2 more times.
I know. Yeah, everyone's always like, whoa.
I know.
I'm using as many metaphors as possible.
Great. No, it was good. Your delivery was fantastic too. Yeah, and sorry, I missed the first probably 2 minutes of your talk, I think, on the recording. Okay. So maybe I can grab it from another one and patch it in or something. But really wonderful stuff. I really like that Carl Rogers quote.
Yeah.
There too. That really kind of sums it up. And it's also exciting because I think I didn't know about the 3, now maybe a 2-year course in Berlin, that psychedelic psychotherapy that includes neurofeedback. That is pretty edge, pretty nice.
Yeah, so the executive director, Sergio Perez, I met him at Breaking Convention, just on the green, and I had Helium with me. So Helium is a virtual reality platform that's interfaced with neurofeedback and the neural meditations as well. And so, hi, come in. She's old, she's like 15. Come on.
Neuro Kitty.
I know, Neuro Kitty. So I started talking about this stuff and he just became really fascinated with it. So he started following me around, and the next thing I know, he went off and trained in neuromeditation, and he's the executive director of Mind, and he's also an anesthesiologist who's transitioned over to becoming a therapist, and he's got this really cool insight already on state shifting. So I'm really excited he invited me to come and teach with him there.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So do people have questions?
There's a question.
Pop it in the chat. Mm-hmm. I can read the question. If on the flip side to the question, what state are you ready for? Do you think the technology will flash warning? Wait, I'll give an indicators warn that you should not try psychedelics.
So there is a phenotype. It's tied to beta spindling in particular, and so these individuals are usually so pressed up into their head. They're avoiding life, like their felt sense, so heavily, and usually for good reason, that to give them a psychedelic may actually create a deepening of their anxiety or worsening of their symptoms, because they need to be, you know, gently brought down. It's like a really like rigid person in a yoga class and you just try to force them into the splits, right? That's not a good experience. And sometimes, you know, we're still understanding what creates a bad trip. We know set and setting is a really important indicator. But I would also say that there are these starting points that our platform, yes, it is hopefully going to say you are not ready for a psychedelic. Now may not be the time. What other therapies can we put in place, and can we track if more flexibility comes in, so that you're more likely to have that mystical effect, which is really that pivotal mental state that leads to those, like an entropy that allows you to get out of the grooves that you're currently kind of stuck in.
So kind of following up on that, um, would, you know, I guess in your current, you know, experiences with working with people, would you say that there's a high percentage of people that should not be doing psychedelics versus, you know, and then kind of along the lines, would a lower dose, for example, be more useful
Yes.
for those people?
So I'm a pretty big advocate. I'm really close friends with Raphael Lancelota, and he's a 5-MeO guy, and he just recently wrote a book chapter on short-acting tryptamines and the importance of that. And you know, as a clinician, I really recognize, and I have, you know, been too heavy-handed with neurofeedback before, both for myself and others, and sometimes you just don't know. Which is part of also why we're keeping this as a clinical tool, because you definitely can send your brain in a direction you don't want to go. You can overtrain. But the short acting tryptamines, the idea is that this is emotional cardio, what people are doing. If you want to move your nervous system from one place to another place, you can, but it takes time and it takes progressive, you know, integration, and you have to take steps to get there. You're not just going to go to the gym and become like, you know, ripped in a day. So same idea. And I think the short acting tryptamines, possibly paired with these technologies, allow people to start moving through state shifting capacities in a way that they can also digest. But more than that, it's also probably the more likely affordable and accessible route. So while I think that, you know, the big sessions are wonderful and I would like to see people prepared for them because they're so costly, it really isn't something that a lot of people can access. You know, it's nice in theory, but it's very expensive. So making sure that when we're going to invest in that, that we're ready, I think is a really important consideration.
Right. Speaking of the mystical experience as a state, as a place, you know, I present this myself as the mystical experience is often more of a resource than a cure in terms of dealing with.
Exactly. So we want a resource. That's exactly it. If we progressively bring your system into connection, you're already so much closer to the mystical state. I really think the mystical state is sometimes also a simple state. It's just so hard to get there because we've got so much stuff on top of it. And it's just when our system is aligned and we can really tap into that deep relationship. So yeah, more resourcing. The more resourced someone is, the more likely they're going to have an experience that could potentially be that pivotal experience.
So moving on to the questions here, we have Derek has asked, are you seeing indicators relating to trauma or healing of trauma?
Yes. So from the research I had done, we often will see that when somebody closes their eyes, we expect to have this thing called alpha blocking, where like their eyes are closed and we'll see an alpha burst in the back of the head. So it increases because now the visual fields are closed down. And so you should be able to like go more into somatic state. But someone who's traumatized tends not to have that. They don't have alpha increase because they're still remaining vigilant, and often there's still a lot going on in their brain. They're still visualizing and seeing a lot of things, or they're in such a dissociative state that they're not even connected to just how driven and vigilant their nervous system is. So that's one indicator. There's a lot of indicators in the right parietal lobe too. We'll see this excess of alpha when you're looking at certain measures in the EEG that will indicate that somebody likely has had some early trauma that influences and changes their ability to socialize and perceive social cues in a way that isn't defensive or anxious. There's also quieting in the frontal lobe. So we'll sometimes see too much theta in the frontal lobe. That's a sign of dissociation or disengagement because too much of the resource has been tied to vigilance. And so there's less resource tied to cognitive processing.
Sounds to me like everyone in a therapeutic office should be wearing a headset.
I think they'd be helpful for diagnostic purposes. Yeah. I mean, we take blood pressure, we take blood work, we do everything. And why when mental health is the last one, I'm like, we have tools. Why aren't we using them?
I totally hear you. This is why I'm so happy that you're here talking to us all today. So we have another question. It's from Sarah, our fabulous assistant here. And her daughter has pretty challenging ADHD and has been using neurofeedback for several years with an excellent practitioner to maintain her brain. And Sarah's wondering if there can ever come a time when her daughter will not rely on it as heavily. Can the brain actually permanently change more so that the neurofeedback, so that the neurofeedback sticks in essence, and also do psychedelics disrupt the progress of a neurofeedback process?
So the answer in all therapy is it depends, if I'm being completely honest. But yes, we can see permanent change. It also depends, age of training and the root cause of what's going on there. Sometimes also the challenge I'll have with just using neurofeedback is that while that can be really useful and sometimes it totally changes someone's brain, they still have to understand how to use their nervous system differently, which is why I really like the neuro meditations, because you actually want to start teaching that individual how to use their state differently, how to engage with their nervous system differently, because that is also going to change the way that they're engaging with their brain. But I would also like to say that divergence is not a disorder. So there is this woman who's written a book called The Divergent Mind, and she's identified 4 divergencies. So autism, sensory processing disorder, ADHD, and a highly sensitive. I definitely fall in the highly sensitive range with a bit of ADHD for sure. But those individuals, sometimes if you were to put them out in the woods, they would be just fine. It's the culture that's creating the challenge. In some ways, you've been hypnotized into pathologizing a healthy response to an unhealthy system. And some of the more highly medicated individuals are the divergent folks. They're kind of like the canaries in the coal mine. And figuring out where that line is something that I'm not even sure where it rests, but I am cautious of pathologizing someone's divergence. And I'm more interested often in teaching them how to relate to it and where could they be strengthened and what, places in the world would be more nourishing for the type of mind that they have. And that's not a disorder. It's just a challenge.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point of view, Heather. And I love that whole idea of, we pathologize way too much.
Yeah, I find, while the diagnostic, the DSM is really useful in many ways, it can also compartmentalize people. And a lot of the neuroscience coming out shows that a lot of the diagnostic categories, when you actually look at the root causes, cut across the diagnostic categories. So we might actually need, they're like leaves on a tree, but I think we need to understand what are the actual branches and what are the roots still, and it might change how we cluster these diagnoses and how we understand them, and that they're more about adaptations to experiences as opposed to disorders, which leaves somebody feeling broken, which doesn't make a lot of room for healing sometimes.
Yeah. Moving along, this is a question about someone missed the name of the headset. And also, speaking of the headset, where can I get my headset? And are you, I think you mentioned something about VR as part of it, or
yeah. So Helium is the company that is interfacing with VR. We literally pulled this off the assembly line, one of the first. And come July, we're going to be able to start shipping, and there are going to be much more of them available for order at that point in time. So these are the Neurosity Crown. and it has, I think it's like 8 channels. So right now we're figuring out what we can do with this. Eventually we're going to want to have other utensils that, or headsets in the kitchen that have more midline sensors, maybe some frontal sensors. But this one is pretty good for calming the brain. A lot of the parietal stuff, we want to slow that down to help people really build that alpha bridge. Stabilizing the brain, it's going to be a good stabilizer too, helpful with focus. Yeah.
So that one would be good for focus as well as
Yes.
calming. And so with someone, is this for the general public then, or do you need a therapist to work with it?
So to work with the Divergence platform, it is clinical. So because it is neurofeedback, I think in the very beginning should be kept in the clinical hands, because I have definitely overtrained my brain. I've seen clients overtrain their brain. And until you should have a relationship with somebody skilled so that you can learn how to use it. And the idea would be able to transition that person into using it a little bit more on their own. But the clinician would probably design a lot of their protocols. And it's really designed to be used between therapy sessions as a means of tracking therapy and augmenting and supporting therapy.
Okay, from Yari, can you speak about the effectiveness of binaural beats, whether used actively or as background audio?
I wouldn't say that my research lens really validates or completely understands. So I would say I can't really speak to that. But I have seen how, what I do understand about it is that I will use oscillating music sometimes because it helps with the habituation response. So what we do is we orient towards something and then we're like, oh, what's that? And then we habituate, and then we orient, and then we habituate. And before we know it, we're way up here. So when we're playing music that's oscillating, it's really hard for the habituation response to get in. So someone's orienting, and then the brain kind of goes, ah, and then it calms down. So that's really helpful.
Fantastic. Good. From Ian, considering how MDMA is useful for trauma, are there EEG patterns that correlate or explain how MDMA is different from classical psychedelics?
Yeah, my understanding with MDMA is that it's far more tied to the amygdala and the salience network. And so we're working a little bit more in that felt sense relationship piece where we would kind of see mindfulness or loving kindness hanging out. Whereas classical psychedelics are a little bit more about dropping the default mode network and then letting content come forward. So if someone has a lot of PTSD and they've got a lot of compartmentalized feelings, you're not going to want to flood them with all of that with a classical psychedelic. We might start by resourcing them with MDMA so that they can meet those parts that they have been pushing away and start developing that relationship so that they're resourced enough so that when they're ready to have like a psychedelic flush, essentially like go deeper into the subconscious, it's not just this rush of, things I don't want to pay attention to. You have a sense of how to hold the space so that you can do some of that further processing. But every brain is different, so it's one way.
Fantastic answer there. Totally appreciate that. From Janet, she has a question about her experience with neurofeedback. She did 6 months of intense training. Her goal was to help with her insomnia and panic, depression, etc. And in the end, after $6,000, she felt like she didn't progress at all. And so she just kind of wants to hear your thoughts on that.
So my question would be, what was the neurofeedback system that the clinician was using?
Yeah, Janet, if you can pop that in the chat if you know the answer to that.
Now, I will say, just like psychedelics, neurofeedback it's not a cure-all. My other question would be, were you doing neurofeedback in conjunction with therapy? Or was it a practitioner who was just beeping you? Because that my personal use of neurofeedback is I'll go between sessions of just training, then relational training, and then all these neuro meditations where I'm teaching them how to work through that. But then we take breaks and we do a lot of somatic processing, and I'm trying to understand, and then I use the neurofeedback to augment the relationship. So there's different ways of doing it, but I don't think I would support a client spending $6,000 and after 1,000, me feeling like they're not getting anywhere. Like I would want to be tracking that.
Right. Yeah, Janet's got an answer here.
Brain spotting after. So that's one of those things where, yeah, unless I had worked with you to understand what is the thing that's keeping you so fixed, where is the resistance there, and there may be a different modality that you need, you might be one of these people who have the spindling beta, and the spindling beta folks are tricky. They're really tricky to move, and you have to, I find, do quite a bit of deeper work. I want to know what's driving your system. But so yes, that can happen. No, it can be very expensive, and some people won't benefit from it. Also, another reason why someone may not benefit from neurofeedback is if there's systemic inflammation in the system. So I have the pulsed electrode and magnetic field that I use often to reduce inflammation in the gut. I'll often think about diet and sleep and all of these other pieces that need to be in place, because you only have so many like workmen in the system. And if you're trying to, if they're all down here working on the gut or systemic inflammation from something else, sometimes Lyme disease can get in the way as well, then how am I going to call half of these workers up to start building stuff in the brain? So we'll see that they get a little bit of change and then they go back. So it could be an inflammation piece as well.
I really like that, using neurofeedback in conjunction with therapy and in a relational way. That's something that I think is gaining more traction, at least therapists obviously know that already, but a lot of the people are just thinking, we just take a little psychedelic and we're off.
It's going to make it better.
They're missing the relational piece.
Yeah.
Really is. Anyway, so let's see. Someone just said video games. I'm not sure what to make of that.
Video games, yeah. So I have a kid who is a Fortnite, all the things machine, and I keep joking with him. I'm like, all right, we're going to train you how to do this so you can play video games with your brain. And I, envision a future where kids they're also siloed, especially right now. And I'm just like, how can I expect anyone to use technology differently? The technology has been built to be addictive. Video games are addictive. Everything is just drawing us and siphoning our attention. But what if the game was more relational? Like, what if you and your friend could move objects, but you both had to enter into a state together in order to achieve that? Or you can quiet the crazy noises in the room if you can achieve a certain state. And then as you achieve these certain states and you learn them, then you unlock new levels. But all the while, in this really fun, playful way, you're, exercising your nervous system. I saw these guys, they had the Thunder Ohm, which was really, really hilarious. And yes, end your relationship will improve. That's just it, right? Let's get back into relationship. Humans need each other. I think the pandemic has really taught us that. And so in the Thunder Ohm paradigm, they were using muses, and you're sitting inside of this like light-oriented triangle thing. And you had to race to be the calmest, but as you got calmer, the sounds and the lights get crazier. So it like really challenges you to be able to like hold that state. And my meditation teacher, and originally he's like, don't just sit in a quiet room doing this. He's like, come on. He's like, that's not real life. So he challenged me, like I'd go sit in bus stations and I'd sit in busy places. And I was like, can I still be calm even with all of this going on around me, which was an important skill for me to learn because I am highly sensitive and I tend to really feel things. So challenging myself to be able to maintain a state even when the world's buzzing was a really helpful skill. So I think the technology and video games and all these things can be used to just, deepen our relationship with selves and our ability to handle the way the world is, and recognize when we're reaching our limit and be kind to ourselves and take a break and come back in and not need to push so much,
And that's particularly intriguing to me, and I think I read it, in one of your posts about two people together, where they have to do something together, both wearing, a headset.
For regulation, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, and it seems like that would feel magical. I think that was the description, but
yeah, we could all have headsets on right now, and I could launch a like group flow meditation experience, and there would be like some sort of sound sequence, but that only kind of calms once we all achieve that. And I have a friend who's an artist who does, he was using the Muse, and he'd have a bunch of people doing yoga together, and then he had lights all the way through the room. And if one person wasn't entering into the state, it would kind of light up over them, but then the room would circle that person and sit with them until they felt like they were part and connected, and then they would all go back. And how nice would that be? You know, as long as you're open to it, not everyone wants that anxiety provoking for something. I totally get it. So this is like, if you want it.
Awesome.
But to, you know, have others around you recognize that you're struggling to be part of the circle.
And that reminds me of a story that Gabor Mate tells about people that are schizophrenic or, you know, have some kind of a disorder in other indigenous cultures. Rather than harming them, you know, people will surround them instead, you know, and really
don't isolate
them and things like that.
That's just beautiful.
And one other little piece of that is the we were talking about the, well, let me just skip that for now and go back to the questions here. Someone was saying that they entered into something of a weeks-long non-ordinary state a decade ago. Because the experience checked off 4 out of the 5 boxes or whatever for a physician at the time, I now have to wear this person with a mental illness sort of badge. Are we at a point now where we can differentiate between persons who have more of a predisposition towards experiencing these states and persons who are experiencing symptoms of some legit pathology?
Yeah, so that's part of what the phenotyping models are about, and that's what we're kind of hoping some of the machine learning will offer as well. But the difference, the quote, there's a book called Breaking Down is Waking Up, and it's all about this bridge between psychiatry and psychosis. And he said that, you know, the difference is that the mystic swims in the same water that the psychotic drowns. And I would say that I've worked with clients through, you know, awakenings and call them psychotic breaks. And oftentimes it's just the fragments, and a lot of times it's when the prefrontal is myelinating, right? And it's seeking to create that relationship deeper in the system, but there's fragments and not a deeper allowing of that relationship. And so then it can create this like block or explosion in the system where the previous models no longer work and that gets shattered, and then the person doesn't have the scaffolding or platform to find themselves within. So we really have to rebuild their sense of self. And when we take the time to do that, instead of just heavily medicating, a lot of folks come out the other end and addressing it early on. Now, I'm not saying medications are bad. I think medications have their place and could be well positioned, but it would be nice if we had an assessment tool that could help us understand where is that person and where might they be having some divergencies in their brain that could support them coming back into relationships so that we can lower their medications and help them find, you know, a place, a relationship that's nourishing for them given where they're at. And, you know, I work with the Hearing Voices Network in the UK, and there was a documentary they made called The Call to Awakening, which is like different snippets of different clinicians and shamans and people who've experienced mystical awakenings talking about what that was like, and in many ways how it was such a transformative experience for them. So again, that's pathologizing. You know, I think there's a way to find when it's clinical and when it's actually growth oriented, and then which direction do we need to take to help that relationship.
Fantastic. Yeah, the tool, I mean, it's clear that the tools that you're talking about with neurofeedback are really important. It would be incredibly useful, more widely adopted and, you know, understood.
So how will Entheon work with clinical psychedelic sessions as more regulation is imposed onto this emerging space of healing? So they're a biomedical company, and basically we're working with them to look at biomarkers and to determine these things and to look a little more deeper into phenotypes. And so that overall conceptualization of the kitchen, they're kind of like the secret sauce. So they'll have some algorithms based on the research they've done that would then be part of the platform, and that would then eventually be part of a clinical setup if a clinic was using this technology.
Yeah, it depends, I think, also perhaps on how much regulation does get put in place with, you know,
totally,
because we don't know what's going to happen with Oregon yet as far as how they're going to structure their sessions.
Yeah. the hope is that we're adding some biometric data to inform regulatory practices.
That's ideal. Yeah, and then if there's getting a little bit political, if decriminalization takes place,
Yeah.
then it'll be more open for other people to work with it in less structured ways. So
100%. And I think the structure and the less structured ways will depend on the nature of what someone's dealing with.
right.
You want to continue to have clinical work, and then you can have work over here that's more of a communal nature. And I think both can be very helpful. It just depends what somebody needs.
Yeah, totally agree. So there was another thought, related to something you were saying earlier about meditating in a busy bus station, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's, because I've heard that this can be an issue with people that are really good meditators, that somehow they can also avoid looking at their trauma and psychedelics because they can go to that place really well. And
yeah,
so if that's the case, how, what's a good way to work with people like that, or to, help them get more in touch with the parts that they are not getting in touch with?
so this has actually been well documented. So Thich Nhat Hanh, when he had his stroke, it was actually neurofeedback that helped him come back from it. So one of his followers, people working with him, is Seaburn Fisher, and she's really well known, and she's been a mentor of mine in the neurofeedback community. And she's known for her work with trauma and neurofeedback. And so when he had his stroke, she was like, "Oh, can I help him?" And so her and a couple other clinicians banded together, and they were able to support him calming his nervous system following the stroke. And then he opened it up for them to work with some of the monks at Plum Village. And they found that, I had this question. I was like, oh, what do they need? Because this was years ago, and it depends. A lot of them knew that there was a place they were having trouble accessing, and sometimes through the technology they could. And so he said this was another Dharma door, that it's another window into self. And I will get individuals who will tell me they've been meditating for a long time, and when I look at their brains, I can see whether or not they're actually shifting their states. So the technology can help me understand, and then I can help them go a little bit deeper with supportive of that. And then once they have that experience, oftentimes it's not that you need to keep using the technology, because you're starting to get a sense of it on your own. And the goal eventually is that now you know what to do.
Right. That makes sense. So neurofeedback can be very helpful in those cases, particularly if you're working at some trauma that someone's trying to get at, and they happen to be a good meditator as well.
Yeah, relaxation-induced anxiety is a real thing that not everyone knows about. Your vascular system and your amygdala get used to a certain way of being used. And if that's a heightened way, then as it comes down, your system goes, we're gonna die. And like, you'll feel panic, or sometimes like shooting lightning bolts through the head as the amygdala kind of kindles. And so when I'm doing neurofeedback with people, I've had clients go into panic, and then we work through that together, and we recognize that, that's just the cardio is too much for you. So we go a little bit slower and eventually bring them back, like down into a state where they're more comfortable. But if we had not had the technology for me to say and push them into that place, they probably wouldn't go. Like, it's really hard to talk them into it, and they often present as looking just fine. But then I put a scanner on their head, and they're like, beta frequencies are like screaming at me, and I'm like, I think you're really anxious right now.
Right. Excellent. Let's see. We have any other questions right now so far? Well, in the meantime,
I had one piece of my question. Hi, Heather. Just one more question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When someone is in the process of a neurofeedback course, do psychedelics or even smoking cannabis, or is there anything that can disrupt it?
It depends on what we're working on, for sure. And if anything, I found I can make use of the psychedelic state because there's entropy, right? So they're a little more flexible afterwards. But I still want that to be in a container where, I'm not a psychedelic therapist at this point. I joke that I fake it till I make it. I'm mostly mimicking the states, but I've helped with integration and preparation. So yes, you can throw your system out. Usually the one thing that tends to kind of throw neurofeedback progress is illness. If someone gets really sick, that can really throw them. But the brain still remembers, and so you can be trained back. Alcohol can do that. Sometimes caffeine can be a bit of a problem, not having a healthy diet. I wouldn't say that I've got a large enough sample to really comment on how psychedelics would be disruptive to this process, since I've always used it where someone is like intentionally going about it, and I've mostly seen it be productive. But I'm sure there are cases where too soon could probably create a defensiveness in the system that then we would need to work through.
Great. We talked a little bit about this earlier, Heather, regarding, say, attachment issues.
Yeah.
And so, of course, bringing the relational piece is a big part of that. And then how neurofeedback also help that process?
I find a lot of times it can be helpful to meet someone, and then if I'm finding it's difficult for them to open, that bringing the technology in kind of creates this little like mediator between me and the client that can bring about some feeling of being seen and validated, because I'm able to map their brain, explain what I see. Oftentimes they're like, oh, it's the first time somebody's, yeah, that's exactly what's going on in my head. And then while they're training, I'll notice, oh, did you just feel tense right there? And so I'm seeing them, right? And this is what attachment is based on, is being seen, being given space to grow. And so as I'm demonstrating that I'm using this technology to support insight, and that I'm also not biased, I'm not sitting here going, oh, well, this is what I think, which I wouldn't do, but that there's the fear of judgment a lot of the times. So it just kind of takes that out of the way, and it kind of piques curiosity, because there's this like novel technology that we're kind of playing with and using to augment our relationship and to really deepen my capacity to see, but also the client's capacity to feel that these changes are happening, and they start seeing themselves more deeply as well.
So I guess what can you tell, I guess the person who's not seeing a neurofeedback therapist, which there are probably very few of, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And like, is there a headset, a VR, device, or something that, what can people do now, let's say, to sort of, and we have neuro meditation, which is a great.
Yeah, the Neuro Meditation Institute and the free stuff that we have on there is a really great way to step in. Helium is a really wonderful way to step in, because the neuro meditations are on that. They have a different band right now that they're working with, but we're hoping we will start interfacing with these headsets as they roll out.
Is Helium a VR headset? Or
it's one of the apps that you can get on the Oculus. Yeah, but they've been made with the neuro meditations in mind. So we have the 4 categories of VR that you can go into that would nurture your ability to experience that. VR is actually a really great tool, because it just induces mindfulness right away. Like you get just taken away. And as a clinician, if I didn't have all this technology, I use a lot of somatic therapy, a lot of just slowly walking people. And I use the neuro meditations in that way too, where we're just slowly, figuring out which attentional processes start bringing that relationship into place. And I guess the most important thing is like, are you working with someone, or are you in relationship with the tool you're using in such a way that you feel comfortable? You feel like there's space for growth. You feel like you could be resourced. You feel like understood or seen. That's most likely going to lead to change, irrespective of the tool. So that relationship is the base. The binaural beats, again, like I said, for the habituation response can be really helpful. It's got a little bit of that EMDR back and forth, calming the system element to it.
Great. So, and does the app work with all the VR headsets, or is there a
Helium? Yeah, Helium does. Mm-hmm.
And you're connected with Helium?
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Okay. Good.
Yeah, Sarah, Jeff, and I go back to the beginning. We all kind of started this process at a similar time. So yeah, I've known them for a while, and I really I appreciate Helium's, their focus is really on compassion, and really that they've always had that want to be relational and caring, and they do a lot of military and veterans and people in hospitals that can't get out of the hospitals. They used to have some videos that like a day in the life of someone to help deepen compassion for the individual. So it's like you are a person in a wheelchair, and what is it like to live your life, you know, when you go through that experience.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you, Heather, again so much. It's such fascinating stuff. I really feel like you're on the cutting edge here with this.
Stay fun.
Connecting all these dots in such a cool way.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for coming. It was great to share this time with you. You can find me on social media and different pages I shared.
Yeah, and keep us posted on what I guess lay people can access in terms of.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I should say our app. The one thing our app, we're in the process of getting it together. So Divergence Neuro app. It's not quite out yet. We're launching next week. We are going to have a really nice breath pacer on there. We're still putting that together, and certain breath practices are really powerful for calming the nervous system. Just heart rate variability is a really amazing tool. You could also get heart math. That's another tool you could consider using, but we will have that, and that will be accessible for everyone.
All right. Well, without further ado, we will say goodbye. And thank you all so much for coming on behalf of Psychedelia Integration and Divergence Media. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a good evening.